Welcome to Life Stories, where we share heartfelt tales of resilience, love, and second chances. Today's story is about Emily, a doctor whose seemingly perfect life unravels when she discovers her husband's shocking betrayal. But from the ashes of heartbreak, Emily embarks on a journey of renewal, finding love, hope, and unexpected miracles along the way. This is a story that reminds us how life's toughest challenges can lead to the most beautiful new beginnings. Subscribe to Life Stories and join us as we dive into today's inspiring tale of courage and transformation. It started like any other day at the hospital. I was halfway through a cup of lukewarm coffee when the emergency call came through. A 5-year-old girl named Sophie. High fever, coughing, and struggling to breathe. It sounded like a routine case, panicked parents and a child with symptoms that could either be a bad cold or something far worse. I grabbed my coat, called out to the nurse to join me, and headed for the ambulance. Technically, it wasn't even my shift, but I had agreed to cover for a colleague who needed the day off. My husband, Andrew, was away on yet another business trip, so staying home held little appeal. The drive was quiet except for the wail of the siren and the hum of the city outside the ambulance. I leaned back against the seat, lost in thought. I had met Andrew during my second year of medical school. Back then, I was a sleep-deprived, overworked student who barely had time to think about relationships. But Andrew had this way of being calm and steady, like a lighthouse in a storm. He persisted, won me over, and we got married soon after I graduated. Our early years together were wonderful, despite the long hours at the hospital and the pressures of his growing car repair business. But over the years, something shifted. Andrew's work began to take him away more often. He'd be gone for a week, sometimes 2, on business trips, leaving me alone in our quiet home. We didn't have children to fill the silence, though not for lack of trying. Test after test came back normal. Yet we remained childless. It was a shadow that hung over me, even as Andrew seemed to brush it off with his usual optimism. If it happens, he'd say. But for me, it was a wound that never quite healed. As we neared the address, I shook off my thoughts. The nurse beside me, a young woman named Claire, was scrolling through the case notes on her tablet. 5 years old. Her? I asked softly. She nodded, glancing at me. Fever, cough, labored breathing. Could be anything. Parents are freaking out. Of course. I murmured. Parents always panicked when their little ones were sick. And who could blame them? There's nothing more terrifying than feeling helpless when your child is suffering. The ambulance pulled up to a modest, well-kept home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. I grabbed my kit and rang the doorbell, my breath visible in the crisp evening air. The door opened almost immediately, revealing a pale, frazzled woman in her late 30s. "Doctor, thank you for coming. Please, come in," she said, stepping aside. Her voice trembled with worry. "Where can I wash my hands?" I asked, scanning the cozy but cluttered living room. She pointed toward a small bathroom off the hallway. Moments later, I was in the bedroom where the little girl lay. Sophie's flushed cheeks and glassy eyes were the first thing I noticed. Her tiny chest rose and fell rapidly, her breath catching in wheezing gasps. She clutched a stuffed rabbit, her wide, frightened eyes locking onto mine. "Hey there, sweetheart," I said softly, kneeling beside her. "I'm Dr. Emily. Let me take a quick look at you." "Okay." Sophie nodded weakly, her little hands gripping the rabbit tighter. As I examined her, the mother hovered nearby, talking a mile a minute. "She's been sick for a week. It started with a cough, and the doctor said it was just a cold. She seemed better, but this morning it got worse. Her breathing, she's struggling, and we can't get her fever down." I nodded, keeping my voice calm and steady. "You did the right thing calling us. Let me see what medication she's been on." "It's in the kitchen," the mother said hurriedly, then called out, "Andrew." Bring the chart. The name hit me like a physical blow. My hands froze mid-motion, my pulse quickening as footsteps approached. The bedroom door creaked open. And there he was, Andrew, holding a medical chart. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. His eyes met mine. And in that instant, everything fell into place. The frequent trips, the distracted phone calls, the unexplained silences. He had a family here. A child. A life I knew nothing about. My hands trembled as I took the chart from him, forcing myself to focus. "Thank you," I said, my voice flat, betraying none of the storm raging inside me. I scanned the notes, scribbled a referral for hospitalization, and made the necessary calls. All the while, I avoided looking at him, pouring every ounce of energy into Sophie. As I crouched beside her bed, her lip quivered. "Can Mommy come with me?" she whispered. "Of course, sweetheart," I said gently. "Your mom will be right there with you. And your dad can come too." I glanced at Andrew, my face carefully controlled, though my heart felt like it might shatter. Back in the ambulance, Claire glanced at me curiously. "Serious case?" she asked. I stared out the window, my fingers tapping restlessly against my thigh. "I don't know," I said after a long pause. "It needs further examination." But my thoughts weren't on Sophie anymore. They were spiraling, piecing together the devastating truth. Sophie was 5. Andrew had been living this double life for at least 6 years. And I had been blind to it all. As the ambulance sped through the streets, I clutched my trembling hands in my lap, fighting the wave of nausea that rose with every realization. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a complete unraveling of the life I thought I knew. The rest of that shift passed in a haze. I went through the motions, treating patients and completing paperwork. But my mind was elsewhere. By the time I got home, the weight of what I'd seen, of what I now knew, crashed over me like a tidal wave. The house was eerily silent. The kind of silence that usually comforted me after a long day. But now, it felt suffocating. Every corner of our home suddenly seemed foreign, as though I was seeing it for the first time and realizing how little it mattered. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at my phone, debating whether to call him. But what would I even say? "Hey, Andrew. I met your daughter today. How long have you been lying to me?" My hands trembled as I put the phone down. No, this wasn't something I could confront over the phone. I needed to face him in person. A part of me hoped I was mistaken. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe Sophie wasn't his daughter, and this was some bizarre coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. The way he froze when he saw me, the panic in his eyes, it told me everything I needed to know. Andrew returned the next day, earlier than planned. I heard the familiar sound of his key in the lock and braced myself, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. When he stepped inside, his face was pale, his eyes heavy with guilt. For a long moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. "How's Sophie?" I asked, my voice cold and detached. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "She's stable. They're running tests, but they think it's just a bad infection." I nodded, crossing my arms. "That's good. I'm glad she's okay." He glanced at me, his expression wary. "Emily," he began. But I cut him off. "How long?" I asked, my voice shaking with barely contained anger. "How long have you been lying to me?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't even know where to start," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Start with the truth." I snapped. 5 years. 6. How long have you had a child with another woman while pretending to be my husband? Andrew flinched at my words, but he didn't deny them. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said, his voice trembling. "It started as a mistake, a fling. I didn't mean for it to go this far. But then Claire got pregnant." "Claire," I repeated bitterly. "You've built a life with her. Andrew. A child. a family. All while telling me we'd have one someday. Was any of this real? Did you ever love me? His shoulders sagged as though the weight of his guilt was finally too much to bear. I did love you, he said softly. I still do. But things got complicated. I didn't want to lose you. Emily. You didn't want to lose me, I said, laughing bitterly. So instead, you lied to me. 4 years. Do you know what that makes you? A coward. Andrew. You didn't just betray me, you stole years of my life. Years I spent trying to fix something that was never broken. You had a child. Andrew. You had everything I wanted. And you didn't even have the decency to tell me. Tears burned my eyes. But I refused to let them fall. Not in front of him. Pack your things, I said. My voice flat. I want you out by tonight. Emily. Please, he started. But I shook my head. No, I said firmly. You don't get to plead your case. Andrew. You don't get to make excuses. This is over. He nodded. His face pale and drawn. I'll go, he said quietly. But, Emily, I am sorry. For everything. I didn't respond. I couldn't. As he gathered his things, I retreated to the bedroom, closing the door behind me. Only then did I let the tears come, silent and unrelenting. That night, the house felt even emptier than before, but in the silence, there was something else: resolve. I didn't know what came next, but I knew one thing for certain: I would never let myself be deceived like this again. I had lost so much to Andrew's lies, but I still had myself, and that was enough to start over. The days that followed were a blur. I went through the motions, working, eating, sleeping, but it all felt hollow. The house that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a monument to betrayal. Memories lingered in every corner: the couch where Andrew and I had watched movies, the kitchen where we'd shared hurried breakfasts before his business trips. It was too much to bear. I needed to leave, to get away from the reminders of a life that had been built on lies. That's how I found myself packing a suitcase and heading to Vermont to stay with my father, Robert. His cozy house in the countryside had always been a haven for me, a place where life moved a little slower and everything seemed simpler. He had retired a few years earlier and moved there after my mother passed away. The city holds too many memories, he had said back then. I hadn't fully understood what he meant until now. When I arrived, he was out in the yard, repairing a section of the wooden fence. He looked up as my car pulled into the driveway, his face breaking into a warm smile. Emily. My girl, he called out, wiping his hands on a rag. You didn't tell me you were coming. What a surprise. I got out of the car and forced a smile. But as soon as I was in his arms, the facade crumbled. Tears spilled down my cheeks as I buried my face in his shoulder. Oh, Dad. I choked out. I don't even know where to start. He held me tightly, his hand gently patting my back. It's all right, Emily. You don't have to say anything yet. Let's get you inside, and we'll figure it out. The house smelled like pine and freshly baked bread, a combination that always made me feel at home. My father busied himself in the kitchen, making tea and setting out a plate of cookies while I sat at the table, trying to compose myself. Now, he said, sitting across from me and folding his hands. Tell me what's going on. The words came tumbling out in a rush. I told him everything: Andrew's double life, the little girl I had unknowingly treated, and the devastating realization that the life I thought I had was a lie. My father listened quietly, his face a mixture of sadness and anger. When I finished, he reached across the table and took my hand. Emily, he said softly, what Andrew did to you is unforgivable. But you're stronger than this. You'll get through it. I don't know how, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I feel like my whole world has fallen apart. He gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. Then we'll build a new one, one step at a time. Over the next few days, I settled into the peaceful rhythm of life in the countryside. The air was crisp and clean, The kind that filled your lungs and made you feel alive. My father kept me busy with small tasks around the house, helping in the garden, chopping firewood, and even fixing an old chair that had been wobbling for years. It wasn't much, but it was enough to distract me from my pain. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that I met Ethan. He was a neighbor who lived on a nearby property, and he had come over to borrow a tool from my father. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with kind eyes and a warm, easy smile. "So you're Robert's daughter," he said, holding out a hand. "I'm Ethan. Nice to meet you." I shook his hand, noting the callus on his fingers, a sign of someone who worked with his hands. "Nice to meet you too," I replied, surprised by how natural it felt to smile at him. Ethan didn't pry or ask uncomfortable questions. Instead, he chatted easily with my father about the weather, the local farmers market, and some repairs he was working on at his own place. It was refreshing to be around someone who expected nothing from me. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself looking forward to Ethan's visits. He had a quiet strength about him, the kind that made you feel safe just being near him. Slowly, without even realizing it, I began to feel lighter. The ache in my chest was still there, but it was less suffocating. Vermont, with its rolling hills and serene stillness, was giving me the space I needed to start putting the pieces of my life back together. As the weeks passed in Vermont, the wounds Andrew's betrayal had left began to feel less raw. It wasn't that I had healed completely, far from it, but the slow, steady rhythm of life in the countryside gave me room to breathe and, more importantly, to think about what came next. One afternoon, as I sat with my father on the porch, sipping tea, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Emily, have you thought about what you'll do next?" he asked. "About where you'll go once you leave here?" The question made my stomach knot. "I've thought about it," I admitted, "but I don't know where to start. The house in Chicago isn't home anymore, and the idea of going back feels unbearable." He nodded, setting his mug down. "You need a fresh start. Somewhere new. And you'll need help to find it." He hesitated before adding, "You know, Ethan might be a good person to talk to about that." I blinked, surprised. "Ethan?" My father smiled faintly. "He's lived in the city before. He knows the ins and outs. And he's got a good head on his shoulders. Besides, he likes helping people. You could do worse than getting some advice from him." It felt strange at first, reaching out to Ethan for something as personal as finding a new home. But when I brought it up during one of his visits, he didn't hesitate. "Of course I'll help," he said, his eyes warm with sincerity. "I have a friend in Boston who's a real estate agent. She's honest and experienced. Let me connect you two." True to his word, Ethan arranged for me to speak with his friend, Sarah. She was sharp, efficient, and patient with my endless questions. Together, we began searching for apartments, and Ethan accompanied me on the occasional trip into the city to view places. His calm demeanor and practical advice kept me grounded when I felt overwhelmed. During one of these trips, we stumbled upon a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood just outside Boston. It was nothing fancy, a one-bedroom with a cozy kitchen and a little balcony, but something about it felt right. As I stood in the sunlit living room, I could picture myself there. For the first time since leaving Chicago, I could see a future that wasn't overshadowed by the past. "This feels like home," I said softly, turning to Ethan. He smiled, his expression both proud and a little wistful. "Then it's yours." The process of buying the apartment was daunting, but Ethan was there every step of the way. He helped me navigate the paperwork, asked questions I wouldn't have thought of, and even insisted on coming along for the final inspection. When it was all done, I handed him the spare key I'd made for emergencies. "I don't know how I would have managed this without you," I said, meaning every word. Ethan shrugged, though there was a warmth in his eyes that betrayed his modesty. "You would have figured it out. But I'm glad I could help." As I settled into my new apartment, Ethan and I continued to see each other, though now it was less about practical matters and more about simply enjoying each other's company. We'd meet for coffee or take walks in the park, talking about everything and nothing. He had a way of making me feel at ease, like I didn't have to pretend to have it all together. One evening, as we sat on a bench overlooking the Charles River, Ethan turned to me with a quiet intensity. "Emily," he said, his voice soft but steady, "I need to tell you something. When I introduced you to Sarah, I had an ulterior motive." I raised an eyebrow, surprised. "An ulterior motive?" He smiled sheepishly. "I recommended that apartment because it's close to my place. I wanted us to be neighbors." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Then I laughed. A genuine, light-hearted laugh that felt like a release. "You wanted to keep an eye on me." "Heh." "Something like that," he admitted, his grin widening. "But only if you're okay with it." I met his gaze, my own smile softening. "I think I'm more than okay with it." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I meant it. Life was starting to feel whole again. Life began to settle into a comfortable rhythm in my new apartment. It wasn't grand or luxurious, but it was mine, a space that symbolized a fresh start. The neighborhood was quiet yet vibrant, filled with little cafes and parks that felt welcoming. Most days, I'd find myself smiling for no particular reason. A far cry from the hollow sadness I'd felt just months ago. Ethan became a regular part of my life, though neither of us had explicitly labeled what we were to each other. He was my friend, my neighbor, and something more that neither of us seemed eager to rush into defining. There was an ease between us, a quiet understanding born from shared histories and mutual respect. With Ethan, there was no pretense. No need to hide my scars. He saw them and stayed anyway. One day, after we'd spent the afternoon assembling a bookshelf for my living room, an endeavor that involved more laughter than actual work, I noticed he seemed unusually pensive. As we sat on the couch, sipping coffee, he turned to me with a seriousness I hadn't seen before. "Emily, there's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice steady but soft. "I've wanted to for a while, but I wasn't sure how." I set my mug down, giving him my full attention. "What is it?" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "When I was married, my ex-wife and I tried to have kids. 4 years. We tried everything, but nothing worked. She eventually had a child with someone else. And that's when I found out I was, well, likely infertile." I blinked, processing his words. "Ethan." I began. But he interrupted gently. "I'm telling you this because I don't want there to be any illusions about what a future with me might look like. I know you've wanted children, and I wouldn't blame you if that's a deal breaker." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. But then I reached out, taking his hand in mine. "Ethan," I said softly, "thank you for telling me. And for the record, I don't see this as a deal breaker. I've faced similar struggles. And I've learned that family doesn't always have to look a certain way. We create our own definitions." His shoulders relaxed, and he gave me a small, grateful smile. "You're incredible. You know that." I laughed, the tension breaking. "I try." Life continued. But something shifted after that conversation. We grew closer, our bond deepening in ways I hadn't expected. And then, one day, everything changed. It started with fatigue, nothing unusual, given my demanding job, but it didn't go away. Then came the nausea, the constant irritability, and a strange sensitivity to smells. At first, I chalked it up to stress or maybe a minor illness. But when it persisted, I knew I needed to get checked out. I called a colleague from medical school, someone I trusted to be both discreet and thorough. After a series of tests, she called me into her office. She had a look on her face I couldn't quite place, a mix of amusement and disbelief. "Emily," she said, leaning back in her chair, "if I didn't know better, I'd think you'd forgotten everything you learned in medical school. What do you mean? I asked, my anxiety spiking. She handed me the test results with a smile. You're 2 months pregnant. The words didn't register at first. That's not possible. I stammered. Both Ethan and I, we can't. Well, either someone made a mistake, or you're a medical miracle, she said, grinning. Congratulations, Emily. I sat there in stunned silence, staring at the paper in my hands. Pregnant. It felt surreal. Like a dream I was afraid to wake from. When I told Ethan later that evening, his reaction mirrored mine. He was quiet at first, processing. And then his face broke into the most radiant smile I'd ever seen. This is unbelievable, he said, his voice thick with emotion. A baby. Our baby. We held each other, laughing and crying, overwhelmed by the miracle we never thought possible. For the first time in years, I felt like life was not only giving me a second chance but gifting me something I'd thought was forever out of reach. The months that followed were a whirlwind, filled with doctor's appointments, nursery planning, and moments of quiet awe as Ethan and I prepared to welcome a child we had never thought we could have. The news of my pregnancy had brought a lightness into our lives, a sense of hope and joy that seemed to erase the shadows of our pasts. Ethan threw himself into preparing for fatherhood with the same quiet determination he approached everything. He spent hours researching cribs, reading parenting books, and even taking on a part-time handyman job to save up for the baby's future. I want to give our child everything, he said one evening, his hands calloused but gentle as they rested on my growing belly. Everything I couldn't give before. His words tugged at my heart. I placed my hand over his and smiled. You already are, Ethan. This baby is so lucky to have you. Despite the excitement, there were moments when doubt and fear crept in. I worried about balancing motherhood with my career, about whether I was strong enough to build a life that felt fractured not long ago. But whenever those thoughts surfaced, Ethan was there, grounding me with his unwavering support. We're in this together, he'd remind me, and I believed him. As my due date approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. Andrew's betrayal, which had once felt like the end of my world, seemed like a distant memory now. I still checked in occasionally about Sophie's health. She was doing well, Andrew had said during one of our brief, polite conversations. They were also expecting another child, a boy. It was a strange but not bitter realization. He had his life, and I had mine, and I wouldn't trade mine for anything. Ethan and I decided to name our daughter Lily. It was fitting, given how Ethan had described the lilacs and lilies that would bloom under the balcony of our apartment in the spring. Lily is perfect, Ethan had said, his voice filled with reverence. She'll be our miracle. When Lily finally arrived, the moment was nothing short of transformative. Holding her in my arms for the first time, I felt a love so overwhelming it brought tears to my eyes. Her tiny fingers curled around mine, and I looked at Ethan, who was already smitten, his eyes shining with unshed tears. She's perfect, he whispered, brushing a kiss across my forehead. Just like her mother. Our home, once so quiet and orderly, became a place of joyful chaos. Lily's cries and giggles filled the rooms, and we quickly learned the art of functioning on little sleep. Ethan was a natural as a father, his patience and tenderness shining in every interaction. Watching him hold Lily, soothing her with a lullaby or rocking her to sleep, filled me with gratitude. He had once doubted whether he could ever be a father. And yet here he was, Lily's rock, her safe place. As Lily grew, so did our family's joy. Maximum, the little boy we had adopted months before Lily's birth, embraced his role as a big brother with gusto. He loved showing Lily his toys and would often sit beside her, reading her stories in his small, earnest voice. She likes it when I read, he'd tell us proudly, his face beaming with a confidence that melted my heart. Our family wasn't conventional by any means, but it was ours, built on love, resilience, and second chances. Ethan and I often marveled at how far we'd come, from two people carrying the weight of their pasts to parents creating a future filled with hope and possibility. One quiet evening, after the children were asleep, Ethan and I sat on the balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. He reached for my hand, his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles. "You know," he said, his voice low and thoughtful, "I used to think life had closed all the doors for me. But meeting you, it was like someone opened a window I didn't even know was there." I smiled, leaning into him. "And you were the fresh air I didn't know I needed," I replied, as we sat there, the laughter of our children echoing faintly from the nursery. I realized something profound. Life had a way of surprising you, of taking what seemed like insurmountable loss and turning it into something beautiful. Ethan, Maximum and Lily weren't just my family, they were my miracles. And in their love, I had found not only healing but the truest fulfillment I had ever known. As I look back on the journey that brought me here, I'm reminded of how life's greatest challenges often pave the way for its most beautiful gifts. What once felt like the end became the beginning of something extraordinary, a life filled with love, laughter, and second chances. Ethan, Maximum and Lily have given me more than I ever dreamed possible. And in them, I've found my home. Our family may not have started in the usual way, but it's ours, built on resilience and unconditional love. Each day, I'm grateful for the twists and turns that led me here. Life doesn't always follow the script we expect. But sometimes, the unexpected is exactly what we need. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales of hope, love, and resilience. See you next time.